Hello and welcome to the Sales Leaders series. I'm your host, Freddie, where I'll be gathering B2B SaaS sales leaders from across the world to answer 5 short, topical B2B SaaS sales questions. These questions are going to be the same each week, bar one, giving you insight and different perspectives into how top performers within the industry think, as well as actionable advice you guys can use in your own selling careers. On this episode of the Sales Leader series, I'm chatting with Gerry Hill. Gerry, ex-professional rugby player to SaaS sales leader, started his sales career in business development initially at Robert Half to then heading up enterprise sales for Frost Sullivan. Having found success in those roles, Gerry then moved to Aistemos to build up their sales function as head of sales, growing their revenue stream from 0 to over 7 million ARR. Gerry has since gone on to start his own sales and SaaS acceleration consultancy firm, written for SaaSsales.io as a columnist, and is now the VP of Sales Strategy, Growth Strategy, and Alliances for EMEA at ConnectAndSell, the patented cloud sales acceleration platform, helping salespeople generate 8 to 10x more live conversations with qualified prospects. I'm sure many of you listening have heard of ConnectAndSell. Gerry, thanks so much for joining me.
Pleasure to be here. Wow, what an intro. I swear my mum needs to hear that because she doesn't know what I'm doing.
I will send that over to her. I will make sure of that. It was a bit of a mouthful, but look, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat to me, Joe.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
Of all of the places I think we could start this conversation, of which there were many, having done some research into your background in sales and SaaS, I think it'd be appropriate to start with, I think, what a lot of sales teams in particular, and especially in SaaS, are struggling with right now, as in lead gen in the last 6 to 9 months. And ConnectAndSell is positioned, I can imagine, in a very unique position to analyze, cold call data across the market, and with teams struggling across sales and in their teams, where, in your opinion, are most teams going wrong, lead gen wise, and what are you telling your team to do that's making a difference?
So I think all demand gen, lead gen, and top of funnel activities predicated on a 4-legged stool, basically, 4 input mechanisms which make it work, regardless of channel. Right, this applies to all channels. List, which can be defined as am I targeting appropriately and effectively. You only need to be 3 to 4% off on your list to start leaking value and time. Data, are we really thinking through robust and resilient ways to acquire the contact data we need in order to be able to execute effectively? And then the last 2 are messaging, which is fundamental to top of funnel work. And it's very, very different to in funnel work, by the way, which is, I think, where a lot of organizations in particular on the product learning side of things get stuff so wrong. And then the last piece is around direct, inherent desire traits, willing to survive some of the worst parts of the job, thrive on that and iterate and show you, real improvement measures around their own performance. And it just requires one of those things to be 5 to 6% off, or an entire demand gen prediction program to just sort of gradually eke away from control. And then when you put in macroeconomic conditions or macro shocks over the top of it, pandemics, interest rates, high churning customer base, it's really easy for one of those things to go out of control in an uncontrollable way. So it requires perfect management, visibility, and control. It requires perfect rep feedback. Often our businesses don't enable that particularly well because we just don't see enough of the data to be able to make the decisions, right? So my sense is that 3 of those functions are expert, but we're asking all of our sales development teams to do a bit of all of it. And nobody in the world is particularly good generally. Salespeople don't get hired because they're brilliant at building lists and sourcing data. They get hired because they've got human conditional things that in-depth tie to relationships and challenges and conversations, not to articulating the perfect list structure. So that's what I think is going so wrong for so many people. We're asking people to do too much administrative work and not enough time spent actively speaking to market at a flow rate, which enables us to change our business decisions. So where do I tell people to spend their time? spend your time on the conversation and use that data to inform the other input mechanisms.
Right. And for that list structure in particular, I mean, how are you, well, where do you see people go wrong specifically on that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a second wave problem, right? Second wave was engagement, multi-channel, multi-sequence, multi-step, multi-thread. So you hear the word multi a lot. Actually, what you want is monothematic, right? I want to be able to define 5 people who could potentially buy my stuff in a business, and each one of those requires a different message. And each one of those messages has to be highly specific to that person's job to be done. And that job to be done can't relate to my product or service acutely in my prospecting activity. It has to apply to a what's in it for the prospect approach. Whereas virtually 98% of reps today send an email, send another email, send a social step, send a voicemails, cold call, send a follow-up. And they basically diminish the returns available on each channel, because effectively what you're doing is you're getting too far into that prospect headspace with persistence, which is a valued trait, but less time actually focusing on the nature of the problem that you solve for in the channel that that prospect wants to be contacted. So when we look at lists at ConnectAndSell, we're building it around very specific themes: job titles, industry segments, countries, problems. And then we do work behind that to validate the channel. So we're going to call people, see if they pick up, and then we'll activate them into a list of people that pick up the phone. We'll email people after that and see whether or not they respond to email. We'll switch to social. We'll switch to their next channel. But what we're not doing is comprehensively exhausting the mind share of one prospect across all these different layers of engagement. We believe every channel works, but every channel only works if it's the prospect's preferred channel. So you've got to work hard to find that out, but it makes it much more efficient. We're talking about financial value, right? If I run a sales engagement platform at best practice, my cost of response is about 90 quid. That's for a response. That's not even for a meeting or a meeting sit. If I validate the channel, I'm probably costing response at about 5 quid. So it's a much more effective motion because you get more responses, but ultimately you're actually reducing your cost of acquisition by a magnitude of about 98%. But because the vendors have done such a phenomenal job at saying, this is how you do outbound, guess what? Everyone does the same thing. And that's what's driving everything down. Like in terms of quality of response, quality of interaction, quality of message. Nobody enjoys it. Like, to put it into context, I was at a financial services conference on productivity a few months ago. And it was frontline investment bankers, people that are in deal making mode, sit with customers. About 400 emails a day on CC, BCC and other things from internal emails. Now start to put vendor email in front of them. I have a data set which can tell you whether or not the consumer price index is going to move this way or that way. Price almighty.
Difficult.
Difficult. It's hard work. So your systemization of it needs to be very, very well thought out. The development model probably needs to collapse around, actually, I want specialists who can do the data validation, list build, send the list, service the list, repair the list, maintain the list. I'd spend hundreds of thousands of pounds for that rather than just spend hundreds of thousands of pounds to have 10 SDRs trying to do bits of each part of that job. I just want my sales development activity to be focused on conversations and channel activation. I don't want them to do any of the prep.
And so validating those different channels, at what point do you stop? Because I think there is, and maybe this is just my perception of this, but there is that thought of with chucking someone into a sequence and, you have to keep going. The average response, is on X amount of steps. I mean, when do you say no on that particular channel?
It varies. So I'm an expert on the phone. I can't really speak to email too much tactically. I know it works, but I don't know at what rate it works in comparison. But let's take, for example, I work with a very big cybersecurity business. They've got $1.5 billion in funding. It's one of the largest software raises in private markets in history. We've kind of found a signal that says at the 14th dial attempt, you should probably kill the list at that point after 14 dial attempts, because you started to layer in more cost than the activities were. Right. And about 50 to 60% of their phone-based meetings are coming off the first and second dial attempt. And then everything else in the long tail happens between 2 and 14. What changes is you've isolated behavior, right? And this is the one thing we don't seem to understand. People who pick up the phone, and they do it repeatedly and they do it consistently. Whereas people that don't pick up the phone, even if you've got their mobile phone number, won't pick up the phone. Even though they've got that buzzing alarm clock in their pocket every single day, they're not going to pick up the phone. So we can isolate that, identify that, then we can move the experiment downstream to the next chain. Then we can just go to email play, but not make it feel like an engagement play, just isolated messages, running isolated messages, make it feel more like a marketing funnel. And then you can do the same for social. But, when we're trying to just sort of bombard people, it's really, but it's also a case of know your market, right? If I'm selling facilities management software, I'm spending 98% of my time in LinkedIn, I should probably be fired as a rep or a rep owner, because my facility manager market updates its LinkedIn exclusively to update its CV. That's it. They're probably active in LinkedIn for about 2.5 minutes a month. Whereas if I'm selling to the SVP of sales in a big company who sells to other sellers, I'm spending my entire life in LinkedIn. I hate LinkedIn, but I'm in LinkedIn all day, every day, because all my buyers are there. So you just need to know where your buyer lives. But if I'm calling facilities managers, I want direct dial and mobile phone numbers because they're multi-site. They're always on call. They're emergency based in a lot of instances. For help testing, bang, just pick up the phone. I've got a conversation. So you really need to have an acute understanding of where your customer lives in order to be able to activate your channel preference. And then you probably rearrange the channel there a little. Don't like, if I sell to FM, I'm going really hard phone first, then I might go to email, then I might go to social. If I'm selling to chief marketing officers in sales tech, I want LinkedIn, phone, email in that.
Makes sense.
It's highly structured. It probably inhibits a lot of the creativity that you'd expect in teams, but actually I want the creative motion to be in a place where you need to be creative, where cognitive thought's required. I don't want anybody dispelling cognitive thought and administrative work ever. Because by the time you actually come to the big moment, the conversation, the articulation of value, the agility to steer people around and deal with sort of objections, bait and switch, Christ, spend time there, please. Get good at that. Don't get good at the other bits.
Switching topic, and this is the question based on my research into your history, which I found quite interesting. And you had a spell, in 2016, you started your own company. And I know since you've obviously gone back to sales leadership, what was one learning that came out of that kind of experience that has paid as a sales leader? Obviously, looking back at, what you were like previously to that, and then obviously since.
Good question. And my immediate response is you start to understand business problems, not domain problem. The best sellers in the world understand business. They don't care about products particularly. Mediocre sellers rely on macro themes that their product relates to. World-class sellers are always able to design around business problems. I could be selling Chili Piper and appointment scheduling software, but unless I can't articulate its impact to the CEO of that company in the context of risk and value, I need to be prepared for that situation. Most people aren't. They're just going to go and speak to the head of marketing on routing to calendar. They're going to lose a lot of value and a lot of deals and a lot of order value as a result. So one thing I found as a business owner, it made me much more acutely aware of business problems, accounting, finance, fundraising, capital flows, what I can afford, what I can't afford, what I might need to seek out investment. By the way, I hated all that work, which is one of the reasons why I went back to being employed. It's not sexy running your own thing. But yeah, that's definitely the number one lesson. So how do you become that? Broad, really broad. You need to be broad based. You want to be interested in absolutely everything. You need to read more widely, is what I say to any first line sales development rep that wants to take this career serious. Don't necessarily just spend all your time on our products and our problems. Go and read the FT every single day. Read The Economist, listen to Wall Street Journal podcasts, listen to venture capital podcasts. Go and find out what private equity guys think about. Get a sense of how investment bankers think, because they ultimately unlock all of our world. So if you can understand that stuff, all of a sudden you're starting to invest your time and energy in the way a CEO has to think. Now, the reason why CEOs like that breadth is because it's the Lonely Hearts Club, right? Or Lonely Minds Club. Being a CEO is a very isolated job. And if they get pitched out constantly and only ever hear about product or product problem fit, they're never, ever going to trust you as fully as if you can say, well, what's the impact to your funding if you don't do this? Or where else can I provide value to you? Can I design something that's going to help you seek out your next round more sufficiently? Can I prevent you from a down round? Those are really good questions. And if you can position yourself as that level of immersion, you're always going to go forward. But I think, most people fall into sales, right? Most people just do enough. Most people rely on their company's product onboarding or, the fact they've now got CRM and some tools, and then they go off and execute. They're not actually thinking. And that's really what the biggest point. And my game got elevated again, having owned a business, run a business, did it reasonably successful and realized I hated doing it. Now being back in an employed role where we sell expensive transformational equipment, I get more deals done on the basis I can speak to business value than I can ever get done just speaking to product or solution value, for sure. And one of the guys that I like following on LinkedIn, he talked about this a lot, Brendan Flaherty, who talked about how he became a multi-million-dollar seller. There's so much truth in that. The ability to just sit, reflect, think, design, draw out solution sets is much more important than just executing talk tracks. And they need to execute talk tracks, but it's that additional layer of abstract thinking around the problem that makes you a better seller.
It goes back to, I'm interested to how you see this, as in it goes back to your answer about how reps should just specialize in the talk tracks. You want to optimize for those conversations. Yeah. At what point would you suggest reps add that element of creativity, if you would want to call it creativity, in understanding that bigger picture, upskilling in that way? Is that onus on the sales rep and that individual?
Well, it's like you want your rep to take the extreme ownership of the territory, but one of the problems that often comes from that is a massive deviation from product value and what can be executed. So one of the reasons why, especially in scale up, many people buy on roadmap trees and product today, especially in SaaS, and then you always end up with high churn customers. So you need control for sure. But how much creativity do you really want if you're trying to build for consistency? I prefer people who are focused on execution and learning as opposed to people that are high creative. Because ultimately, if you're in a good place, good product, good market, good space, good company, most of the creative problem steps have already been resolved for by the time you join the business. I just want people that are happy to execute at a certain point. Now, in scale up, it's different. You don't know what you don't know. You've only testing hypotheses, right? So you haven't got a real sense of what the experiment is. So run every experiment you possibly can and scientifically measure it. And it might turn out you require high creative index for how you go to market. Like I nearly became a customer of a company called Cluster, a revenue forecasting company, because they put a huge amount of effort into appealing to my ego and some high personalization. I don't normally respond to that, but I did that. And actually, when you look at their execution in other channels, because it's a reasonably saturated market, they didn't stand out. So they needed to do something differentiated. Guess what they did? They systemized it as a process because they found alpha from that activity, which is an old trading term, right? We've found profit. So yeah, every company can be exclusively creative when they need to be, but at some point you need to codify it. And there are certain things like nobody in Connect and Sell needs to be high creative. We've just got such a structured playbook. You just need to be really good at executing and problem solving when the problems come up. But I don't require a high degree of left brain creativity. I just require you to be commercially aware in the context of the problem set out in the business. And then you should execute repeatedly and consistently at least 50%. That's really good. But it's a maturity question. I find more up to them.
Yeah.
And 1 or 2 reps in a team of 20, guess what? They probably have the right to go and be creative. But it isn't right for everybody. And if you let everybody be creative, then you're generally creating chaos and not systemizing. And companies don't scale off long systemized things generally.
Yep. Yeah. Taking a bit of a turn here, and this is a question that we ask everyone that I get on this show. And you can be as specific as you would like with this. You've been in sales and the tech space and consulting for over 15 years now. If you had to name one, what has been your toughest moment in your career? If you had to choose one, how have you dealt with it? And what advice would you have, or do you have, for others, not necessarily to avoid the same pitfalls, but to better deal with them when and if they come across the same one?
Yeah, I think there was a trade in my career where I didn't necessarily lean into problem sets in the way that I needed to. I didn't want to confront them. So I procrastinate on them. And then they're just solving the problem immediately, then compound. And when you compound problems, they're always significantly worse than when you just lean into them. And that creates chaos, and it creates a lack of trust, and it creates a lack of control. I mean, it means that a micro example is just perennially bad forecasting. People living on hope, happy years, not leaning into whether a deal actually exists, which plays to what you guys do as a business, right? But it's an example of a micro behavior that, if allowed to compound, really impacts significantly. I think when I was my very first head of sales job, I allowed a couple of things to compound. They became fantasy almost, not intentionally, but that's where they headed. And, I just spent my entire life consuming negative energy on trying to repair something that, if I just leaned into it on day one, it would never have got to that stage. And it's easy to do because you're the nexus of the business. You're responsible for so much. You're dealing with so many other things. I'm just going to let this one thing falter. And if you let that one thing falter and you don't lean into it, it comes down. It's kind of like having a 5-year-old. Like, your 5-year-old is going to lie to you, right? It's just inevitable because they haven't figured life out yet. But, eventually that will compound if they don't own up to it at some point. I mean, it can be from the best of places and the highest of intentions. And, you genuinely might believe something, but generally speaking, if you allow that to happen, it could be really crippling for most people. True, and it doesn't come back from it after that. And I see it consistently across different teams, different maturity levels, different systems, even in massive companies. And it always starts from a good place, but you can't let it go. And mine was so small, but I still think about it. Right? It was, a silly and embarrassing situation. And you learn from it. But, that would be the one thing. So the sales professionally, lean into the problem, approach it head on with your customer immediately so that it doesn't become an issue. You communicate effectively internally and you're generally in a good place. But essentially you try to don't want this uncomfortable conversation and let it just go. That tiny thing to become a big thing very quickly. That would be the major thing that I'd always be looking for behaviorally with anybody, is that level of self-awareness and that ability to do unnatural things. And that's the dichotomy of being a seller. Most people get into sales because, guess what? They've been told they're awesome, they're fun, they're really high relationship. But actually, those people are probably the worst people at most of the time because they don't necessarily want to piss people off. So they're uncomfortable saying uncomfortable things. The best sellers are probably a little bit ambivert and don't have a problem leading into a problem going, you know what, we've got an issue here.
And being honest and challenging.
Yeah, I think honesty is such a pejorative word. Like, it isn't as absolute as people seem to think it is. Like, honesty is the most important, attribution, of course, for character in sales. But, sometimes you just misinterpret and mishear and then go back and requalify. And that could be as basic as the stem of problem for something. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you get caught up in that pressure. Well, what's happening here? Well, you just remember the last conversation, but you only ever remember it about 5 to 10%, never 100%. It's just you. And that's where the compounding effect happens. So yeah, it just always feels, and you can always tell when somebody's being disingenuous, right? But a lot of people get themselves in that menace. And a lot of people don't know how to come back from that. It's a real sort of resilience test in a lot of instances. So yeah, that's the number one thing I'd be looking for, is just real precision in communication outwards and inwards. And generally a lot of the stresses and pressures that come with being a salesperson immediately go away. Yeah. Whereas if you can't lean in and you just let something come down, you're probably going to be quite sort of self-destructive ultimately. There's a lot of self-destructive behavior in tech sales, by the way. I see it every day, and it's not coming from a bad place. It's just people don't know how to do something because they've never been taught how to do something. Character, it's a parenting issue, not a company issue.
Yeah. And is that on the sales leader themselves to help reps better deal with that, or come back and bounce back? Or is that literally from, hiring, right?
Hiring is a big part of it. We put a huge amount of emphasis on integrity and resilience in our hiring process. I'm always going to take the guy that's a little bit less polished, but shows a high degree of integrity and resilience than I am the guy who's super polished, but just seems a little bit too good to be true. Because at least for the first person, I know that they've probably seen some stuff that they can get through, and character wise, that makes a big difference. And then I think you've got to give people multiple chances, but if it's a behavior leakage on similar concerns over and over and over and over again, at what point do you just cut bait and say, actually, you're not going to change? Here's a fun fact. Humans don't really change much behaviorally from the age of 4 on. So if you're prone to repetitive behavior because of a value stream that's missing, you're going to do it again and again to varying degrees. One degree might be why, one degree might not be. But if it compounds towards self-destruction, then you've got to be able to identify that, because that carries huge business. Now, you might get away with it, but imagine the impact that has on customers. Competitive deal. Like, if you're a competitive deal, your rep behaves badly, that could be a 5-year swing where you're never going to win that revenue for another 5 years. That's a big consequence. It's not just that one-time effort, right?
Thinking back to those roles in previous companies, I'm interested in your sales experience, and especially having sold enterprise and worked with large businesses across all sorts of different companies and roles, whether that's Aistemos, Frost Sullivan, or either AI. Is there anything that you'd say that you learned from those roles that helped you stand out in selling enterprise, especially having done so well to maintain 100% quota attainment, and especially during, you were selling what during the 08, 09 financial crisis and downturns. What would you say to that?
Yeah, the bigger the company area, the easier it is because you're enabled around it, right? Brand equity, you've got product propositions, you've got heritage, you've got an understanding of the value streams because you've got so much referenceable custom material from beforehand. You've got an entire bench of resources that you can bring in as required. And then the lower down the sort of company status, size, stage of maturity you go, the harder it gets. And you've got to be very clear on what you actually mean by an enterprise deal. Is it enterprise logo, or is it an actual enterprise win across an entire company? And variously. And I see too many people, especially in scale-ups, classify enterprise as the win, not the actual total domination in your category across an entire company of 15,000 seats. So you need to be very clear on the definition. Enterprise selling in younger companies is much harder. That's such a natural statement. It's not something that most people think about. They think they create an enterprise product. Have you thought about security on day one? Have you thought about your ISOs? Have you thought about your SOC 2s? Have you thought about what potential hurdle rates are? Have you got a defensible EULA that sits in a way that creates less friction for a legal team in a big company that sees more of them than you ever would in your entire lifetime on a daily basis? Have you got an implementation process which is robust and rigorous and containerized around risk and value? Are you able to show value? Now, most startups and scale-ups, I'd argue it's actually easier to do your deal on somebody else's paper than it is on your own paper. Right? And that's actually something that we did a little bit of at Ava, which is we'd go in behind advisory like Deloitte or any of the sort of government clouds and people. And we'd just simply be part of the solution set. Now, we acquired the logo, we got the adoption, had zero friction. We met a different hurdle rate. The hurdle rate was the chosen vendors' hurdles had already been met, right? So a much simpler strategy. At Aistemos, it was exhausting. Right? We had really robust legal processes because of the nature of our own business, but it was comprehensively new. So our enterprise wins, whilst they were big companies, you'd be looking at maybe, I was still seeing adoption stories coming out of Aistemos, which is now Cypher, 5 years after I left, on logos that I'd originally won. I didn't win like the experiment, I won the pilot, the 6-month here, the 12-month there, the 3 users, the business unit, which is like good, it's trailblazing, but you're not actually selling enterprise deals. You're just selling into big companies. It's a tiny fraction. So, that's interesting. And then you've got a question, is it worth it? Like in Frost Sullivan, it's completely worth it because once you're embedded, you can really expand. They had a sort of key account strategy anyway, which was 80-20. So, BP, I literally sold into 17 accounts while I was there. And each one of those accounts had significant expansion and growth. And I never touched any other businesses in one entire time. in 6.5 years. Aistemos was just a series of experiments across 4 markets, which is exhausting for one person to do because you don't become an expert at any one thing. 2.5 years later, yeah, I've got like this little smattering of success stories and logos and press releases. But actually imagine a world if we consolidated around one problem set exclusively and became world class at that. Would probably be on like 40 logos in that category and then earn the right to go to the next category much faster. So you've really got to define what you actually want success to look like and why the enterprise matters. Most companies aren't ready for the enterprise, and I've been around too many vanity projects. And that's the worst thing for a scale up or a startup is, yeah, we're now going to go up market. Well, you better be qualified. You better be willing to level up. You better be willing to have all of the infrastructural processes around. Because if not, it's going to be a 3-year experiment failure that is basically driven by your ego, not anything else. So I try and check people on that all the time.
Yeah, makes sense. I can imagine that's also, I mean, just as important for customer success as well. If you don't have the capability to help that new logo adopt whatever you're trying to sell, I mean, what is the point in bothering selling?
Yeah, I mean, we sometimes struggle with it at ConnectAndSell. We sell enterprise size deals by revenue, but they might be 6 to 7 seats. They're not necessarily going in at the price of a coffee cup like Salesforce would do to 20,000 seats at Gerry Hill. You know, I'm selling 6 seats for 200 grand. That's a different skill set altogether. So you're selling enterprise seamless deals into the mid-market. You know, you better have a different set of skills, the ability to overcome sticker shock, the availability to talk risk and value, the ability to show that big isn't beautiful, that lean, effective, enabled is better, right? You better have conviction. So, you know, it comes back down to like marketing skill characteristics, proposition characteristics, product characteristics, talk track characteristics, and stay in your swim lane. They're really good businesses that just choose to become verticalized and dominant, and all credit to them. Sometimes I think we look up at like the big, broad vertical, cross-vertical businesses like Salesforce and go, oh my God. But not everyone can do that. Not everyone can become good at everything. Just become good at one thing, be my advice to most people. And if I'm a sales leader looking for a gig in a startup or scale up and I've come out of a big company, my number one bit of advice would be, can they be really good in one thing? And have I got the attention span to care about that one thing and stay out the course of the experiment? Or am I going to have to want to take on everything and probably be good at nothing? That was the trap I fell into at Aistemos. So I'm still good at my job, but I could have been so much better if I just focused my entire effort, time and attention into the one objective.
Great answer. This is final question, Gerry.
Yeah.
Wrapping up here. This is a question given to you by a previous guest, Volker Paluda. He's been in SaaS sales for over 20 years, similar to you, and he's also running a consultancy firm. So quite a few similarities here. And he asks you, Gerry, is entertaining clients in person still the ultimate way of moving a deal forward?
You could unblock a lot of inertia. I'm going to be pretty old school here. You just got to be very judicious about why you're going to do it. You can't just go out for a bun fight. It needs to have thought, focused effort. It can't be exclusively just trying to bribe somebody with cigars and getting them pissed, right? I don't believe that works. But providing there's immense content value attached to it. Like we invest in a community called CRO Connected. Big shout out, much better from our business perspective than any of the other communities that we see in the sales world. We get a lot of business out of that, but it's indirect, right? So we sponsor it. This 2-day summit. We get an opportunity to do golf, webinar, learning content. We get a chance to do roundtables. We get a chance to do workshops. We get to inform the agenda. But at the same time, we get 115 people that carry a sort of CRO or VP job title. Providing we execute really well, we see a lot of pipeline growth from that one effort. We then get 2 dinners a year. Those dinners are very, very specific though. They're themed. They've got content attached to them. They've got learning. There's 20 minutes of us being able to sit in front of the customer audience of 30 people. So that's a one to micro many, if that makes sense. You know, audiences of 30 to 100 people. Can you still take somebody out? Yeah, definitely. It depends. Like when I was at Aistemos, so we were selling to regulated industries a lot more. So it was around about the time when we had the Rugby World Cup in the UK. We got tickets and stuff. I could hardly find a single customer that was able to take that offer, right? BAE Systems definitely couldn't. 2 hedge funds we were working with, one of them required me to send him a receipt for a breakfast briefing for the cost of the breakfast, and they're $8.95, right? Whereas in my world today, it's probably a little bit less acute. Do you know where I spend most of my time when I do intimates? Not dinner, not drinks, golf. Golf's been a real driver for me like the last 4 to 5 years with my cousin.
Right.
You know,
Why is that?
we just play golf.
Why is that? Why?
I think so. I don't know if you've seen this in your life, but when you know somebody's reasonably good at something, you kind of look at them slightly differently. Like I can always have an easy conversation with somebody who's played like National One's Premiership because there's that look, you know, they know. People like the opportunity to get out of the office. People like the fresh air. One thing about golf that's hugely limiting is it's still exceptionally male dominated. So, you know, if I'm selling to a female CRO, I'm probably struggling a little bit. So to find something other than a dinner, you know, we live in a quite a sensitive world these days at times. You need to be very mindful. Are you taking other people? Like, you've just got to think a lot more than when I started my career, where you had almost an unlimited T&E at Frost Sullivan, and, you know, provided you weren't an idiot, pretty much get away with anything. But those days are very different. Now it needs to be much more thoughtful. It needs to sit on the budget sheet. You need to have a justification for doing it. And it needs to show almost immediate yield. So yeah, I think the intimacy matters. I think curation is the right way to do it. I think people appreciate time away from office. I think people appreciate time away from Zoom. Provided you're an interesting and interested person, you can actually learn a whole bunch more about those people and their intrinsic motivations than you can ever do in a formal business setting. So on that grounds alone, it has a huge amount of value. But at the same time, you can't force people into it. I think people are more aware of how they spend their time since COVID. I think people are much more appreciative of the time they get to spend at home. I think people are less motivated to just get on a train to do something because they feel they have to do. So it has to dovetail with the right deal, the right time, the right personality, and the right way to get it. And it always has to feel high value. Like I've got a friend who got fired from service now. He's doing really well, but he got caught on an expenses thing because it wasn't a validated dinner. And then alternatively, a guy who was a better producer there at that time found out he'd been like expensing bottles of rosé for his best client, Mo. His best client, Mo, was a Muslim, and it turned out he'd been taking his wife and claiming those expenses. But he was number one at the top of the table, didn't get fired. So there's huge hypocrisy around that stuff. So you need to standardize it and make sure that the behaviors are well addressed. But yeah, I think it can be hugely valuable to summarize, but just requires thought. It needs to be the right deal with the right people.
Fantastic answer, Gerry. Look, I really appreciate you joining us. They were all of the questions that I had. For anyone listening or watching this podcast, there'll be a bunch of links and resources about Gerry, ConnectAndSell, and some of the other bits and bobs that you've done or do below wherever you're listening or watching this. Gerry, before we wrap up, is there any final parting words you'd like to leave the audience with?
It's got to be fun. The whole thing's got to be fun. The whole journey's got to be fun. If you're not having fun doing this job, find a different job. If you can't make it fun, then you're not going to get the best out of it. And you know, don't take yourself too seriously. I think there are a lot of the elite sellers have kind of forgotten that recently. So yeah, lean into your own failings, be self-aware, and try and make it as fun and as organic as possible for your prospect. And you're going to have a sustainable career. When you try and force it too much and you're too serious, people are going to just go no. So yeah, be self-aware. That's the number one message.
Fantastic, Gerry. And to all those listening, we'll see you next week. Cheers.